Just change the setting.
No.
He said put it online.
Figuring out.
He's down here. He played a little thing behind you.
Not anyway. Yeah.
Yes.
He's looking for a cue. We're good to go, right? Yeah, go for it.
We're all set?
Yep.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to our newsroom ethics panel. I'd like to point out, first of all, in the back, we have snacks, and then we also have handouts. We have handouts from DePaul, from the Center for Journalism, Integrity, and Excellence, and then we also have handouts from the Chicago Tribune, the Tribune's Code of Editorial Principles. My name's John Owens. I'm the chair for special events with the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences here in Chicago, serving the Chicago and Midwest chapter. We have an illustrious panel here today to talk about all sorts of issues concerning newsroom ethics. We'll have time for questions, audience questions after the panel discussion. This is an event that's co-sponsored by NATIS and also by the group Free Spirit Media. So again, welcome to everybody. In this age of fake news versus real news, the importance of newsroom ethics can't be understated. To earn the public's trust, journalists must strive to be accurate, objective, fair, and ethical. So today we're going to engage some of the region's best-known journalists in a panel discussion about newsroom ethics issues. And I'd like to start off by introducing our illustrious panel. To the far left, we have Margaret Holt. She's the ombudsman for the Chicago Tribune. We have Marin. She's the co-director for the Center of Journalism, Integrity, and Excellence at DePaul University, and also the political editor for NBC News and an interviewer for Chicago Tonight. We have Marsha Bartel, who is an investigative producer for WGN-TV. We have Resita Cox, a reporter for the online news organization City Bureau. We have Maggie Bowman, who's a producer for the documentary house Kartemquin Films, and she just released a film, Hard Earned, earlier this year. And then Don Moseley, who's also a co-director for the Center for Journalism Integrity and Excellence at DePaul University. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Anjali Misra with Free Spirit Media.
There. Hi everyone, can everyone hear me okay? Yes. Awesome. Thank you all so much for coming and welcome again. John, thank you for the introductions and thank you to our panelists for being here. I know we're all really excited. I know we have some Free Spirit Media participants in the audience. As John mentioned, I am a staff member at Free Spirit Media. So we are a youth-focused media production organization focused in the South and West Sides neighborhoods in Chicago. So we're really excited to be here, and hopefully our students can, capture some thoughts and thought-provoking sort of things from our panelists today. As we know, we have a lot of wisdom in the room. But yeah, without further ado, just for the sake of time, I will go ahead and get us started. with our questions for the panelists. So some of these will be directed towards the entire panel, and some of these will be, and I'll let you know if I have particular questions or follow-up questions for individuals. And just a quick reminder to, just so that we are capturing the thoughts of as many of you as possible, keeping responses clear, concise. I feel like I don't need to tell you all that because this is like, you know, old news to you. But all right, on to our first question. So a journalist's job is to report facts to the public, but the idea of fake news has become a big issue in the media world. How do you know if something you read or watch is true? How did fake news start and grow, you know, from your perspectives? Specifically in online media, and how can responsible journalists combat this trend? That was a multi-part question, and this is something that any of the panelists can respond to.
So fake news began with the caveman, when he scrawled with his little, you know, pounding device, himself is slightly stronger than he really looked in person, and the demon he killed is enormous, telling a tale that isn't really true. Fake news has been with us forever. And fake news certainly preceded Donald Trump and the election of 2016. I tell this to students all the time. You want to read fake news as you Google, because Google is not a secure source of true information a lot of the time. Google my name and put next to my name the name of Sherman Skolnick. Sherman Skolnick was a court watcher. He was a reporter, and he was a little nuts. He wrote a piece that said, I was embedded with the federal government in my reporting career, that I went on the attack of a Congressman, Henry Hyde, that my family owned NBC. It was all a lie. And so I emailed Sherman, he's gone now, he's died, and said, Sherman, take this down. It's not true. And he said, I have it on the best authority. It's still there, and it looks like a real report. It looks like a study. So fake news is what we're calling it now, but it has always been a presence in our lives.
And I believe that social media, as you kind of mentioned in the question, has played a very big part in expanding fake news. Again, fake news has always been around. We've started calling it fake news in the past year or so, but there have always been fake news stories, as she just explained. But social media has done something incredible, and not in a good way, whereas they have a platform and an interface where they can make this fake news look so much like real news. And so you're scrolling on Twitter, right? And you just see headlines now. And that's what's made fake news kind of explode, because who can really tell what a real headline is if you don't actually go to the website? And if you're not a journalist, or if you're not someone who knows how to immediately spot fake news, you're easily tricked by that. And that's because all of these headlines look the same in the little blurb that you get on Facebook or Twitter. And so I guess the question was, in the past year or so, how has it changed? Since Twitter has been around, I think it was founded in 2006 and become popular in 2009. Up until then, it's absolutely exploded, in my opinion, and that's kind of the negative impact social media has had on journalism.
Facts matter. It all begins with facts. You can't even begin to talk about ethics unless you're talking first about accuracy. And so in Chicago, we are blessed to have this great legacy of the City News Bureau. And we could do this in a chorus. You know where I'm headed with this. If your mother says she loves you, check it out. And if you take nothing more from today, that is one of the biggest definers that's different from fake news and so forth. But it is so important. Verification is what makes us different. Facts matter. Our job as journalists is to get facts. Truth is mutable. Truth is the meaning that people assign to facts. So our challenge is to vet, the process of verification, to get facts clear so that people can assemble them in however they choose to assemble them, so they can define what is truth for them. But facts, it all begins with facts. If your mother says she loves you, check it out.
I think it also has to do with specificity. The big story right now across the country is the Roy Moore story in Alabama. Being from Alabama, I watched it closer than maybe some of you. But if you read the Washington Post report about Roy Moore, they quoted 30 sources. A day or two after that story aired, I was watching a piece by a local television reporter in Birmingham who went to a small community outside of Birmingham, and she said she talked to a lot of people. Now, who are you going to believe? Somebody who talks to 30, says specifically, 30 sources. What's your definition of a lot? I don't know what her definition is. I doubt if it meets my definition of what is a lot. So specificity, as you look at these things, I think especially for the people who watch and read, is of paramount importance.
I would say consumers have become too passive.
Lazy.
Reporters, consumers, we're all too passive. And you got to look at more than just the headlines. You can't just look at your Facebook feed and, that's interesting, that's interesting. It's feeding everything that you believe. But you've got to do a little more work on your own, too. I mean, sort of shame on us. If we fall for the fake news, then what's your responsibility? And I would say you need to be responsible yourself. As the younger group, not just taking what you read and not even going any further, checking it out. So I would urge everybody to be better consumers.
We'll probably get into this a little later in terms of how ethics might happen differently in documentary film than in conventional journalism, but I think that the one principle that at Kartemquin Films that is so important to us, that I think is critical to all of journalism, is transparency. Our point of view, our lens on the story, making that clear to the audience, so the audience has the information they need to weigh the information that's being presented to them. And so because as Margaret said, truth is a value you assign to facts. When you get into complicated emotional storytelling and different people's version of what they think might happen to themselves, how do you assess whether or not that's true and whether or not it's objective? And I think that the real key is it's on us as the storytellers to be transparent about the point of view we're coming from, who funds us, who's funding the story that we're telling, and what role we have in the story.
And my last job, I worked at a TV news station in North Carolina. A big part that we will always try to incorporate into our reporting was process. And kind of, piggybacking off of what you said, transparency. Young journalists in the audience, is very important to describe how you got to point A to point B to your audience in your stories, whether that be print, TV news, broadcast, whatever it may be. Explain how you got to where you got to, so that people don't have they can't call it fake news, right, if you tell them exactly what you did, because you can't argue with facts. So present the facts and then just leave it there on the table for people to consume. And you do that by showing them how you got to point A to point B.
Yeah, at one point I wanted to add to this discussion too, and that's that facts are not just upon what you see right before you, those details. I think you also, as a critical consumer, and you're looking at fake news, whether it can be trusted or not, you also have to ask yourself, what's the voice that's missing? And I think it's so easy for us, to your point about us being lazy as consumers, it's so easy for us to stop at what we see and to look at that. And we should be asking ourselves, what's the voice that's missing? If you look in Chicago, diversity is a big issue for me. I'm very interested in it. My mother's family was Native American, and so I'm very interested in a diverse city like Chicago and about different voices. So the game, is really about having more voices, and to look there and to say to yourself, wait a minute, who's not in this conversation that needs to be there? And that's another really important element just in all kinds of assessments of news, fake or otherwise.
Thank you all so much for your responses. So kind of, a good segue, I think, continuing this idea of some of the things you all mentioned, accuracy, specificity, providing a clear lens for consumers, transparency, diversity of voices. I wonder, in particular, Carol, Don, and Marsha, can you all talk about how journalists can determine the reliability of sources, and how do you know when to use an anonymous source?
It's a good question, and it's a hard thing. All three of us have broken stories of a critical nature based on anonymous sources. And I know, going back to earlier NBC years, Don and I had a source that was always right and took great risks in talking to us, to the point where in the newsroom we only called him number one. We never said his name for fear, if someone did know his name, that bad things...
Or her name.
or her name, bad things would happen. Could lose your job, could lose everything. And so, but the first story we ever did based on that source, we really needed corroboration. We needed documents. We needed something to support what was being said. And it takes an enormous amount of work to do that. The Washington Post years ago had the two-source rule. We have a two-source rule too, unless, in those rare instances, the one source is better than any other source. And it's not a complete answer to your question, but you spend a lot of sleepless nights kind of assembling the various pieces of that story, looking at what the source's motive may be. And a lot of times sources have mean, vengeful motives. Doesn't mean their information is wrong, but means they're telling you something because they're angry or they're upset or they're disturbed.
But this is also a source that we started dealing with in 1985, and our really first big story using the source was in 1989. So there's a great deal of
time on the line
and getting to know this person so that we felt comfortable. This all goes back to a FBI sting at City Hall where they took down aldermen and judges and a state senator, and it was a pretty big story at the time, and it was a hallmark story for us. But this was a source that we worked for 4 years before we were able to really put the information that the source was telling us on TV. And so I think when you use anonymous sources, you use them carefully, but you vet them, maybe not for 4 years, but you vet them for a long time, and you really have to know where they are coming from, their background, the foundation of their knowledge, and at that point you're able to go and put those things either in print or on the air.
And I just think you have to think of a source as a lead. I don't think you can make them your be-all, end-all person, because most sources do have motives when they're coming to you. So you need to know what that motive is so you can sort of put it in perspective as to how you're going to go forward. So I take sources as a lead, and then I try to go from what they're telling me, and I live for documents. So if I can find a document to corroborate whatever the source is saying, I'm happy.
And 60 Minutes live for documents, and a lot of people lost their jobs when the document was falsified or was not able to be verified.
Right. So you take it as a lead, you work it, you work it, you work it, you work it, and then you have to just keep coming up with more and more pieces of information. I just don't think one source, as valuable as they are, can be your end source. And I really try not to use anonymous sources anymore. You know, I just think unless there's no other option.
So Watergate was a blessing and a curse, because Watergate used Deep Throat, and everybody, all you high school students, this is ancient history for you, but you understand what they were doing. But, you know, all of a sudden, you know, we were young reporters, Carol and Marsha and Margaret and I, and, you know, you dream you're standing up in front of the White House, and according to my source, you know, and it sounds so cool, and you think you've got something that everybody else does, but, you know, you've got to be very, very careful on those. And I know, for instance, and especially as you start out in your careers on those things, to be really, 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 really careful about that. I know all our scripts, and I'm sure your scripts are now vetted by lawyers, and to put something on the air that says according to a source, it's not going to get by in a market like Chicago or New York or Los Angeles or Cleveland. It may get by in Rock Island or something like that. But so you got to really be your own police person on those sorts of things and really think carefully about using those.
Thank you all. So, Resita, this next question is for you in particular. As many of our panelists just spoke to, this idea of credibility, reliability, making sure that your sources are credible and reliable. How has social media complicated this? And I'm wondering if you mentioned social media before, but I'm wondering if you can talk about the ways that social media has both helped you and also negative impacts, and how you've navigated that.
Yeah, so social media has helped a ton. As a TV news reporter, I have a fan page, right? And so I have a constant incoming of messages about stories. And so that's what every journalist's dream is. Just like dig through stories, figure out what you want to do. But that's the gift and the curse, because then you have to dig through those stories and you have to figure out, okay, like you said, motive. Is this person telling the truth? Is this actually a story? And so it's time consuming. But back to the positive side of social media, it's so easy to find sources now. I've done so many stories that I've found on Facebook or on Twitter, and it's as simple as I did a story last year of a case of police brutality, and there was a video going around on Facebook. It had tons of shares, tons of views. I'm like, oh, this is news. I need to do a story on this. How do I find the people in this video? Well, of course, you just go look at who shared it originally, and there goes the person. There's a witness who recorded it, and you send them a message, right? And so it's as simple as that. Where and I have been a journalist as long as social media has been around, so I don't know what the process was before just finding someone on Facebook, but it's so simple, and so that's been a blessing. The positive side, like I said, the negative side of social media is you don't know what's real sometimes. You have to go through the extra step of verifying your sources from social media, making sure that what they're saying on their Facebook status or what they're sending you to your inbox on your page is actually real, and also just like I said previously, how social media has just changed how people consume their news. It's like people just read headlines now, and that's all of the work actual journalists go through to do those stories, and to know that people are just going by and they're just like, oh, that's a cool headline, and they'll share it, but you actually didn't read the story. And so I think that's a big negative side of social media.
Thank you for kind of presenting both challenges and opportunities. This next question is actually for Margaret. So as we know, we have a lot of young journalists in the room, and just kind of speaking to these young journalists, can you describe what a conflict of interest is, and as it relates to reporters in particular, and how reporters can avoid conflicts of interest?
Well, here's a personal example. I am a huge Chicago Sky fan. I am the last person in the world you should ever send to cover a Chicago Sky game. It would be impossible for me to be unbiased. And on a more practical level, the late, great Jerome Holtzman, who was a baseball writer in the Hall of Fame, wrote an epic book, and it was first published in '73. It was done again in '95. The name of it is No Cheering in the Press Box. That has been used in many journalism programs, and it is true not just for sports, but for everything. It's true for if you are covering theater, or if you're covering the arts or movies. You cannot be a fan. You have to be able to have some separation. You can't get too personally connected to these things. You know, if you go to cover a hockey game and you're wearing a Blackhawks shirt, not a good idea. So there are so many things about this that are just so practical, and you can start now. And we had a little bit of this discussion. I like your point about transparency, Maggie, because I think that's also important. In social social media. You have to own who you are, and I call your attention to the handouts that John has put out from I have an excerpt from our social media things, and it talks about you have to really be transparent in your identification on social media about who and what you are, so that, mine says very simply, that I like sports and theater, and that, I'm an employee of the Chicago Tribune. You cannot separate your persona from your social media presence. And so it is who you are, and you have to be very, very careful, and you have to own it. If you're transparent about it up front, and you say, these are my interests, then people have a sense of that, and then that should guide you as well. I do think there's one area where it's a little bit challenging and it's much trickier, and this is because we live in very heated times, in the area of race and gender. No one asks white people if they really are qualified to write about powerful white men failing, and yet they raise the question about whether people of color can safely write about Black Lives Matter. So we need to take a step back and ask ourselves, are we being fair in applying how these conflicts happen? And we live in a very multifaceted world, and we have to always be aware and conscious of the many different fault lines and intersections of all of these issues. So understand that how you're perceived by others may not be how you see yourself. So you have to be really careful about how you present yourself professionally in the world.
Marsha, Don, and I were all in the same newsroom at the time. I think Carol Moseley Braun became the first African-American female senator in the United States Senate. It was an historic moment, and we had also done some very tough reporting on her and some of her finances, which made our reporter quite unpopular at the time because it went against the tide of exhilaration that she was coming into power at a time when we hadn't seen a person like her. She came to our newsroom for a live shot one day.
That night, it was the night she won.
The night she won, and
yeah.
That's right. And I mean, she won. It was amazing. And some of the people in the newsroom stood up and started applauding. I was furious with them and told them, no cheering in the press box. None. She had two opponents. We don't take a side. We don't belong to anybody's club. We're not anyone's friend. They're not our friends. They are people we report on fairly and evenly. And that's a very hard thing to impress on new journalists, especially at this time of social media.
Tell them the Hainer story in 2008.
So I joined the Sun-Times. It's an unusual thing. I'm a television reporter. Usually print people go to TV. I was a TV person who went to print. My first election working for the Sun-Times, the editor-in-chief gathered us all together, and he said, the first thing we do is we get the numbers. I don't want to see any analysis till we just know who won and who lost. And he said, and I don't want to hear anything in the newsroom about what you hope or think about somebody who won or lost. We're not there to have somebody we support. We're there to report the facts. And it was one of the cleanest messages I'd ever heard in a newsroom about what our job is, and you go do it and be proud of it because it is a point of pride for us.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but actually the next question is for you. So, but kind of before shifting gears a little bit, just kind of want to emphasize what these panelists have shared in terms of the importance of integrity, right? And so, if we can put a word to what the panelists have shared about, sort of not bringing bias or not bringing opinion into things. I think integrity is a good word. Hopefully you all agree. So Maggie, this next question is for you, and as I said, shifting gears a little bit. So journalists have to be very careful in how they use media that they themselves didn't create. And, for example, showing someone else's clips in their news package, or times that you've perhaps used footage for what you've produced. Can you talk us through the difference between copyright and fair use, and specifically how journalists can use licensed material in their work?
Sure.
Thanks.
And I hope we get to come back to the question of bias and whose friend are you, because there are some interesting differences about how in documentary film, especially long-form storytelling where we develop really close relationships, that we address those questions a little differently. I think would be interesting to talk about. Fair use is a way of finding the balance in copyright law that we are both, we are all here makers of material that can be copyrighted and at times are users of material that has already been copyrighted. And so finding the balance between the rights of the maker and the user is what fair use law is about. So how do you both protect one's right to materially and morally benefit from what they have created with the right for free expression in a fair society in which creators can quote and use other work that's been copyrighted to make a new point. And so this has been part of copyright law for a very long time, but and documentary filmmakers in the 90s and sort of into the early 2000s started to find it much more difficult to use copyrighted material without paying license fees that were exorbitant and restricted their ability to have this free expression. And so in 2005, a group of documentary filmmakers and intellectual property lawyers got together and put out a very important best practices in fair use statement, which I'm going to, I did not have the actual copies to bring, but I'll leave this up here, which is, everyone can go get it at this website. It just really is truly a Bible for this. So basically the idea was, let's take the law that exists. It's like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it is. If you don't use it, it gets ignored, and the broadcasters will sort of tell you, you have to license absolutely everything. And we don't think that that's what the law says. And so the basic idea is that you have to follow a couple of principles. Was the material used in a transformative way that was something other than what it was originally intended for? So when I use a clip from let's say WGN, a story about the weather on a given day, but I'm using it in a sequence that's part of, combined with some other clips that is intended to create a new use. Is that fair use? And so those are, and the law, it really in the end is up to a judge if one's right to using material is challenged. It can go to court, and the judge will look at these questions. Was it transformative, and was it a reasonable amount of use? So did you use 5 seconds of this clip, or did you use 2 minutes? And it might vary. Some of the main things that this statement puts forth are a couple of examples of really common uses of copyrighted material that are not laid out in the law, but that we kind of go by in documentary as our guidelines. If it was a parody, for example, that's a really strong case of fair use. Incidental background, so something you are filming a scene. The classic example that we like to use at Kartemquin is in Hoop Dreams, the documentary that Kartemquin made in the 90s. There's a birthday party scene, and they're singing Happy Birthday. And for many years, it was thought, oh, you have to license Happy Birthday, because that's, even though you never asked the characters to sing that song, they're singing it, someone else wrote it, someone else owns it. And at that time, Kartemquin and the filmmakers kind of gave in to that prevailing wisdom and paid $5,000 to license Happy Birthday. Since that time, we've through some of these intellectual property lawyers that have really helped educate us about it, we've bonded together with other documentary filmmakers and rights holders and said, that is ridiculous. We have an absolute fair use right to show Happy Birthday. And now there's actually a class action lawsuit, and Gordon Quinn likes to say if we can just find the original contract, we could join the class action lawsuit and get some money back for the $5,000 that we spent to license it. So that's in an incidental background. Then there would be historical context, so if something is being used to kind of paint a historical picture. And the fourth one, sorry folks, capturing, no, I'm so sorry. Employing copyrighted material as the object of social or political or cultural critique. So that's once again a transformative nature of the way that you would use this material. And this, like I said, it's a muscle, and it's one that we are constantly, as users of copyrighted material, constantly having to speak out for our right to do it. And I've been dealing very much in the last week with a very major broadcaster for whom we are creating a work. In this case, it's a podcast. And we have very strong fair use claims, and one of the foremost fair use attorneys in the country has looked at the claims of both archival and music that we're using in this. But basically, the network is scared, and they have decided to ignore the law and instead follow some business priorities, because they're afraid of being sued, but also they don't want other people to make the claims about the material that they've created. So it's a struggle, and it's one that we approach it not in a way that let's exploit this fair use law, but let's understand it and use it. We are makers of material as well, so we also want to be able to have our right to materially and morally benefit from the creation of our work, but we know that other people being able to use our material is very important in a free expression in a democracy.
Thank you so much. And I know that you were also interested in maybe looping back to the previous question. I don't know if you wanted to speak a little bit more to.
Sure. I just think it's the question of, in the case such as Hoop Dreams, which is similar to a lot of films that Kartemquin has made, we as filmmakers, and I didn't work on that film, but the filmmakers are spending quite a lot of time in the lives of the subjects. So there is a friendship, there is a relationship. We are gaining intimate access to their lives in a way that we think does shift the dynamic a little bit. We think that therefore it's important to be transparent about our relationship with them, and transparent about what is where do we stand? So an example in a very recent film by Steve James, Abacus, which is about the only bank that was really prosecuted in the mortgage fraud scandal, is a small family-owned bank in Chinatown in New York. And Steve tells the story of this family and gets to know the family quite deeply. And pretty much from the beginning of the film that that's where Steve stands. Steve stands with this family. At the same time, he makes a huge effort. He gets the prosecuting district attorney and the assistant district attorney on camera explaining. He gets a juror who had mixed feelings about it. So you're going to hear from other sides of the story, but it is pretty clear to the audience from the beginning where Steve stands on this, which is that he thinks that this family story hasn't been told yet. So we just have a slightly different interpretation of this question of bias, whose side are you on, and objectivity. And we don't necessarily think there is something that's we can't make something that's completely objective. We can make something that we think is very honest, and we're going to be transparent about the voices that we are making room for.
But there's really differences, and we tend to confuse the public. You read a newspaper, you read Margaret's newspaper, and there's the news section. And that's supposed to be straight down the line. Then there's the editorial page, which is opinion. When you label, or there's a documentary, which has really got a point of view. There are different sort of silos of this, and we tend to confuse the public. If you watch cable TV, MSNBC is vastly different than Lester Holt's NBC Nightly News, because he's a straight down the middle But the cables very often are just full of commentary and attitude, and they come out of the same company. You go, well, what the hell is that? And sometimes they're the same correspondents. But on the nightly news, they don't do any of that sort of opinion making. And on MSNBC, they do. And so I think in a lot of ways, we fail people in explaining. This is a column. Tribune likes to call it an analysis. I call them columns. You know, I mean, I think it's a dodge. But not you, Margaret. But this. But your job is to make it clear to yourself. I mean, ask, what is this thing? Is Hoop Dreams a point of view? Is it a, is a fair-minded? Is my story fair-minded as a news piece? You've got to kind of come at us and make your own decisions, but we need to make do a better job of making our distinctions, I think.
I want to add to that. I think that if you're a Fox News reporter, your life is tough right now, because Fox News has successfully marketed itself as news when in fact it's commentary on cable. And so Sean Hannity, they'll say, well, Fox News said. And if you are a Fox News reporter, you carry that baggage when you go to report a story. And I think and I spend a lot of time talking with readers who call and talk about the bias question and all those things. And my example that I'll use is whether you take John Cass or Clarence Page, they are very clearly columnists. They're identified as such. John is very conservative. Clarence Page is very liberal, but their views are presented as opinion and as columns. They do not, Clarence Page and John Cass do not speak for the Chicago Tribune. And yet, I think that is the challenge. We need to do a better job of saying more often what those roles are, because we have readers who say, well, Fox News said, and it's really Sean Hannity that they're quoting. They, more than anyone else, more than MSNBC, have really conflated the issues.
And I just want to point out that I don't think that any of this difference with documentary excuses documentarians from doing good reporting that's underlying their work. And there is an effort right now in the documentary field to try to bring a set of standards, of journalistic standards, into the work, knowing that there's a real proliferation of documentary out there and that the audience is confused. We do have a responsibility as documentarians to fact check, to do due diligence, to reach out to that district attorney who, there are some differences between the forms, but we still need to do the work that we are expecting, that hard reporting that underlies the kind of journalism that the rest of the panelists are talking about.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hear some of you speaking to or getting back to the need for consumers in particular to be critical and differentiate between, sort of the motivations for documentaries and the different standards, the developing ethics and standards within documentary filmmaking being, very much separate from news and reporting and journalism. And so, yeah, thank you for kind of speaking to that and providing examples for some of our journalists in the room. So this is kind of a final question, and I think we do have a good amount of time. So I think that there's room for all of our panelists to share thoughts before we open up the room to questions from the audience. But something we've talked about is the importance of, journalists having thick skin, or journalists and reporters being always on their toes, right? So can you talk, and this is a question to the entire panel, about a time you've been literally kicked out or asked to leave a space. What did you do, and how can our audience know when they have to leave? What rights do journalists have in filming news events in public and versus private and public settings? So if
I've been kicked out of so many places. So. And it just to reiterate, you do have to have tough skin. It's not about you personally, but when you show up to someone's house with a camera, they might not want to be on camera, so you have to leave. And that's a good example. So I used to do consumer and troubleshooting reporting at another station in North Carolina. I'm fresh to Chicago, by the way. And we would basically be tasked with going after people who have, for example, like a contractor who was supposed to do work for someone and they took the money and didn't do the work, we would go and knock on their door and say, hey, like, you did this thing, you can't do that. And so obviously those people didn't want to see us ever. And so we would get doors slammed in our faces. Me and the reporter once walked through the garage to knock on the door. You can't knock on people's doors unless they have like a very big no trespassing sign. You can knock on the door. Once they tell you to leave, you have to leave, but you can go knock on the door. So we went in to knock on his door, and he saw that it was us, and he told us to leave, so we started to leave, but then he started closing his garage door. So, oh my God, scary. So we had to run out of there. Don't get trapped in someone's garage. It's a bad thing. And so that was just an example of like that. It's not about you personally, but if someone does ask you to leave their house, you have to leave. I've been kicked out of like businesses. You can't be in someone's business if they tell you to leave, but the sidewalk is public. So if you want to just go across the street and film their business, you can. They can't do anything about that. And so that's kind of how we handled stories like that. I was doing a story about a charity drive, and there was a woman who was going around and giving out clothes to nursing homes, but for some reason the nursing home didn't want us inside. And so we just kind of waited for her to come out, and we like set up on the other side of the road and like filmed her going in and out. So that was the alternative to that. But yeah, trespassing is a big thing, and a lot of times people will not want you, especially if you're doing a critical story, in their driveway or in their business, and you have to kind of figure out a way around that. So yeah.
You know, politicians, and this is very bipartisan. This applies to Barack Obama. It applies to Rahm Emanuel. It applies to Donald Trump. It applied to George Bush. When you try to cover them, they can sort of set the rules, especially as they ascend higher and higher and have cadres of bodyguards. None of them are particularly or were particularly user-friendly to the press. None of them really like the press. And our job is to somehow cover them whether they want us there or not. And that's sort of your challenge, too. I had a news director in Tennessee. Don had the same news director. The head of the prison system did not want to talk to us. He's a public official. We're paying him. We're taxpayers. He wouldn't talk, he wouldn't talk, he wouldn't talk. After a fair number of tries, this is the sort of answer. After we tried once, tried twice, tried 3 times, my news director said, chase him. And so he came out of a meeting, and we had a camera on the corner, and we chased him. Now, he didn't want us to talk, but we're on a public space, and the other part is the public's entitled to know just how hard it is to get someone to talk to you. Barack Obama did not want to talk during the first campaign about Tony Rezko, a developer who gave him a lot of money. It took the Tribune and the Sun-Times 18 months of stories to force him to come to the editorial board to talk about something that was a simple thing. What was your relationship? How much money did you get? What were the terms of the relationship? So you have to not only have a thick skin when people don't like you, but you have to have a sense of fair intention that everyone is susceptible to a story, most particularly public officials.
Sorry, guys.
Marsha has tuberculosis here.
She's very sick, so I apologize.
You need to arm yourself with education before you even get into these situations. We're fortunate at the Tribune. We have a media lawyer, and we have some regular briefings and staff to talk about these issues, about what you can, what you can't do, and how you can claim your right as a reporter. But there are tremendous resources. I know Casey is here. He works on these issues. The Society of Professional Journalists.
Casey, would you stand up? Casey Buckrow was doing this ethics stuff before anybody else. Set up an ethics hotline for reporters to call when they were in trouble and they didn't have a company to back them up.
So I want you to be aware that there are resources out there that you can use. You may not have regular access to legal training, but there are ways that you can educate yourself so you're not flying blind. When you go to cover something and somebody says, you know, I'm not doing that, well then you have, at least you have the background before you go, you've prepared and you know what you can or what you can't do. Really important. And then the other thing to do is, just keep your eye out. There are all kinds of training. There's all kinds of training that's available. We just did a session recently in cooperation with there's an association of media lawyers, and they have grant money, and they do these road shows in different markets where it's really a whole day of really great legal training. And it was especially helpful, I think, for freelancers and for people from small news organizations. So really, if you're look around for these things. There's ways for you to learn as much as you can. Local press associations. I'm on the board of the Illinois Press Association. They have very active presentations and awareness of basic guidelines about what you can and you can't do. So,
and an attorney, Donald Craven, you can call if you have
Don is a great
question.
resource.
Yeah.
So there are things that you can do even before you get to this position, and prepare. I mean, if it suddenly hits you and it's a shock, well, you haven't done your job because you haven't gotten up to speed. You can't go into this. You got to go into this knowing. And to this point about open media, it's also a question of, it's one thing in the city of Chicago, we're more likely to be able to stand our ground and get what we need to do because it's this market and people understand that these are the rules of engagement. But I will tell you, our reporters in the suburban offices, they go toe-to-toe all the time. Every week there's some kind of a challenge because somebody who's there's a rate increase for sewer and water in a small suburb and people are mad, and they'll try to bar reporters, and they don't take kindly to city slickers from the Chicago Tribune coming out to cover their business. So we have that, and it happens on the ground at grassroots level everywhere, and you have to be able to push it. We just had a story in today's paper, in today's Tribune coverage, about the settlement we won this case with the College of DePaul and the foundation, and it cost taxpayers $500,000 because they improperly resisted the release of public documents. So we will fight for this, but at every level in the media coverage and food chain, it's incumbent upon all of us to know what we have a right to and when we should exercise that.
Sometimes it's from a storytelling standpoint, it actually is good to get kicked out of public buildings. We were doing stories years and years ago in the town of Cicero. The town president was a woman by the name of Betty Lauren Maltese. Her husband was a mob associate. And Betty decided at some point they're going to name the public safety building after her husband, the Maltese Public Safety Building, and we decided to do a story. It's obviously a public building. I went out with a camera crew to get pictures and hopefully sound of Ms. Lauren Maltese. They're dedicating the building. At the same time, Carol was interviewing an assistant U.S. attorney about the unusual nature of a public safety building being named after a mobster. We were in there we got into the building for a little bit and got kicked out. But, from a storytelling standpoint, it was really kind of nice to say we got kicked out by the town president from the Cicero new building named for a mobster. So sometimes it's not such a bad thing to get kicked out. It was actually kind of fun.
Shows you're trying.
Yeah.
Now, I've covered presidential campaigns since Ronald Reagan. Unfortunately, that's how old I am. But I have to tell you, this last one, there was a huge difference. We went to the Republican campaign. We were shouted out, told, "You liberal media, get out of here." We're sitting in an elevator, and people just the supporters started attacking us in the elevator using
Was this in
curse
Cleveland?
Yes.
Yeah, we had the same thing.
I've never seen anything like that before. Now, times have changed, but it was a very different atmosphere, and there were times where we actually felt like this was not a safe place to be. And that's not a good way for us to be moving. So in this environment, I think you need to have a stronger skin, but I also think you need to defend yourself and be able to say, that's not who I am, and be able to speak out. It's been ugly. in some of these polls where the press has to cover because there's been such a vicious attack on journalists.
Yeah, they want bias. It's their bias.
Exactly. Exactly.
We had a situation in a film that I produced, Election Day, where we were covering, we had camera crews in 14 different locations around the country on the presidential election of 2004. And state by state, what you have access to film in a polling place varies. But we had a crew here in Chicago where, we knew that it was our right to go inside of the polling places. And the slight difference with documentaries is that there's often a requirement and an expectation that you're going to get personal appearance releases. And so, but there were some times where we weren't going to be able to. So there was a poll watcher that got into a kerfuffle with another poll watcher, and he was sitting too close, and we filmed it, and he said, I don't want to be on camera. And we not only included that bit in the film because we felt we had a right to be there, and we didn't have a release from him, but we also thought there was an important part of transparency. We were letting the viewer see that he had said to us, I don't want to be on camera. But we did feel it was our right to be there covering this democratic process. It is tricky with the releases, and this is the kind of thing that when you go to get your errors and omission insurance for a documentary, there is an expectation that you're going to have appearance releases for everyone in your film. And there are ways that when you don't, then we go to our lawyer and have conversations such as, was there a reasonable expectation of privacy? And if there wasn't, then we think that we would have a bulletproof claim if that person were to sue us. So it's a little bit trickier with documentaries, and I'm not sure to what extent news networks, I know when we were working on Hard Earned, which was for Al Jazeera America, they said at that time that they were starting to require their reporters to get appearance releases, which I was surprised by. And I thought that was kind of rare, and I don't know if that's come into any other newsrooms.
No. It's, for you young journalists, for you students, this may just be way in the weeds, but if you're doing just basic news, you don't have to, and you're shooting out in public places, or even if someone lets you into their home and says, yes, you may record me, you don't need them to sign a document. In documentaries, in many cases too, you have to give them at least $1. Is there still a fee sometimes?
Oh, no, we never pay them.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're talking about if you use the facility. If you were shooting a documentary in here, we would pay them $1 for the use of the facility, just to say that.
To create a transaction. Mm-hmm. But documentaries are one world. And I completely agree with you too. It's got to be as fact-based. Columns have to be fact-based. News reports have to be fact-based. But in those kind of crazy distinctions, no, we don't. Nobody signs a release in the news stories that we do.
Can I ask one? Margaret came and talked to our class at DePaul the other day, and I really want her to, in 60 seconds or whatever, to do this. One of the great things she came and talked about, we all make mistakes. As you're a reporter, you're going to make a mistake. I've made a dozen of them, 2 dozen, 3 dozen, I don't know how many. You're all going to make a mistake. But the great thing when you make mistakes is you own your mistake immediately. But she said something that was so great about
the baseball
and the shortstops.
Oh.
I think it's so important, especially for young reporters, to hear.
Yeah, and I think it is interesting. It's painful when you make a mistake, and you should ache a little when you make a mistake. But what's the point of making a mistake if you don't learn from it? And the people who make the most mistakes are often the ones who have the most challenging assignments and the most difficult jobs, because they're the ones you trust on deadline when everything really counts to be there and to make crucial decisions. And so my baseball analogy flowing off of that is the guy sitting on the bench is error-free because he's not in the game. Nobody trusts him, right? And the person who's playing shortstop, that person is handling the trickiest, toughest plays. So you would expect that person would make more mistakes, because who do you want to handle it? So, mistakes are okay, but you've got to try and be new and be creative and new in your mistakes. If you're making the same one over and over again, that is on you. But you got to learn from them, and you got to move on, and you have to understand life without risk is not worth living, and the same is true with mistakes. If we made an error-free, completely error-free product, whether it's a story for broadcast or a news story, we aren't trying hard enough. If we aren't going further and having difficulty, but we've got to make every effort to get that. But our constraints are to do the best we can with the time we have available, and to know that you have internal credibility. And if you are somebody who has built up a level of trust with your bosses, you're going to have that chance to be that shortstop, to make those tough calls and those tough plays, because there's trust internally. And if you are a slug, you know, you're going to be on the bench, and you're not going to be anybody who gets the chance to do those great assignments. So you build your credibility internally, day by day.
So don't be a slug.
Exactly.
Resita, I'm wondering if you can maybe offer a final remark about maybe a final piece of advice or something that our young journalists can take away with them.
Yeah, we got into non-bias and transparency and being objective, and as a journalist of color, and I'm looking out in the audience, a lot of young people of color in the audience, I want to say that journalism has changed in the past year, and I can say that, and I'm still a young journalist myself, right? And I've witnessed it change in just a year, and I feel my identity's like at war with one another. You know, on one instance, you're taught to be non-biased, and you're taught to be objective in your reporting, and then on the other side is I'm a woman of color, and I'm reporting in this era of Trump with an administration that is oftentimes blatantly racist, right? And I posed this question to a lot of my professors. I went to school at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And how do you report in this era as a person of color? What do you do? And he very simply told me that journalism is also supposed to push the world closer to the truth and push the world closer to what is right. And racism is wrong. And I'm not going to go balance a story that is about a racist person. I'm not going to balance a story that is on the topic of racism. I'm not going to go ask someone, should Muslims be allowed in the country? That's racism, okay? And I've had news directors tell me that I need to balance this story. And as a black woman, I'm like, I don't think that story deserves balance. And I think for journalists of color, know how to be aggressive in your reporting, know how to have integrity, right, and present the facts, as we've all said. But there are some stories that don't deserve both sides. Every side doesn't need a voice.
I'm so glad you said that, because I think there's a danger in false equivalencies, and that's what you're really speaking about. That just because, you know, sometimes things just are, and you know, it's not as saying, well, somebody said something bad about XYZ, so I have to go find something bad about, ABC. No, some things simply are, and I'm so glad you raised that point, because it is about false equivalency.
But I disagree. I mean, I agree that there should not be false equivalency, but I disagree that if you decide it's racist, you don't cover the other side. Because I think in this country, for people who believe that they've got a good answer for Muslims being banned, you've got to hear their voice. Even if you disagree with it, even if you think in your own experience it's racist, I think you need to hear what they are likely to have a point of view on that is legislated upon by people in Congress who might believe that. And so what we tell our reporters is, I am not a white reporter. I'm a reporter who is white, Swedish, and Native American. You are, I think when newsrooms start saying black reporters, and we've seen this happen, cover black people, and brown people cover brown people, we really lose the talent and the breadth and the depth of people who can see multi-dimensional stories. And so I don't believe that if you do the Ku Klux Klan versus someone and they say kill black people, you say, well, let's get a different point of view on that. I understand what you're saying there. But I think there are nuances on this that we've got to be careful about judging the right of someone to speak.
But you have, how long, let's take climate change as an example. let's say there's 1 in 100 scientists right now who will dispute that climate change is happening. How long will we keep writing stories where you give that one scientist the voice? And I do think that this is part of our role at proportionality and the voices, and that those are not equivalent positions.
And I agree with you. They're not equal.
It's very nuanced.
But it's very nuanced. So I wouldn't put them as equal either. And I wouldn't put the Klan as equal to someone who is discussing constitutional rights and justice. But that they do exist, even in minority form, needs at least some acknowledgement out of the fairness of the fact that they're still operating in the system.
And I'm kind of in between the two of you, okay? Because I think we are giving too much voice to the KKK and some of this other stuff. And I think we do need to say, enough. So I think there does need to be, it's very nuanced, and my advice at the end of the day is that when I first started, everything to me was black and white. I knew right from wrong, I was certain, and I was gung-ho and ready to go out and tell the world. And what I found out as I've gotten older, there's all these little shades of gray. And some of them are right, some of them are wrong, some are a little closer, but it's never as simple as this is right, this is wrong. It's somewhere in there. And you got to start accepting that the world is not right and wrong, black and white.
Two sides of a story, there are 10 sides of a story.
Exactly. Well, I think you've got that nuance that you need to have in between there. But I think we're giving too much voice to
I think there's one more element that I want to raise, and that is newsrooms are historically, traditionally, especially at the top levels, run by traditional white older men. And I think it's, on the one hand, it sends a very difficult message to young journalists as we try to hire people of color, and then we say, but wait a minute. And so, I mean, I think it is tremendously difficult if you are a young person of color to try to balance a lot of this stuff. And I think that we are in this period of great change. I certainly, I see some of this just in terms of regard to social media and so forth. People come, one reason, part of the package of values that people bring to the job is the fact that they see the world in different ways. And I know for myself, I am not only what people think I am, and as I'm sure you are, and you are, and you are. And so all of us, I mean, I think it's really important to take that step back, and we may make a mistake or two in adjusting for the pendulum to swing in that direction. But I believe that is a really valuable voice that some of these young people bring, because they see the world through a very different prism from the other more developed and traditional view. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that there, unfortunately, race exists. It is the foundation in which our country was built on, right? Slaves built our country. And so there is a difference between a journalist of color and the perspective they bring and the understanding they bring to certain stories. And that's when you get into the need to diversify all of the newsrooms across the country, because if you don't have those voices and those perspectives, you end up with a front page story and a headline that is extremely offensive. But no one knew it was offensive because there was no one of color in the editorial board discussing that, right? And so I disagree. I think that there are some stories that don't have multiple sides. I think that there are some stories that don't need to be balanced, and those are the stories that are just outright wrong. And I think as journalists, we aren't doing our due diligence if we give a platform for those people.
So it actually sounds like, from what I'm hearing, that you all actually do agree in terms of, like, when a journalist or your subject or your source or anyone, their human rights are being violated, like, that's a no-brainer. Like, that's not okay, right? And so we don't have to make a distinction there in terms of, like, what it is and what it isn't. But it is important, obviously, to tell a story or tell or present facts that are happening. So To me, it sounds like you all are agreeing, but.
No, I think there's some definite differences, and that's a good thing. And I come back to Maggie's point. I think that was a really good example is climate.
Yeah.
I mean, what point? What, you know?
Sure. Well,
Which are all things you should think about.
absolutely. You know, I think this is a good opportunity as our panelists were speaking and kind of breaking down some of these topics. I heard some murmurings, and I know that there might be some questions in the audience, and so we have reached that time. We have a mic up here if anyone would like to address a particular question to any one of our panelists or all of our panelists. We do have plenty of time for that.
Could we just ask, would you raise your hands who are students here? Because I think we really want to hear from you. I mean, you're our future. And so your questions are, not that everybody's questions aren't important, but your questions are really important. Go ahead.
Go.
Should we bring the mic to people, or they should go to it? Just sit down.
Or which?
Just let them talk.
Besides, you're too tall for that mic.
So my name's Ben. I'm a student at Barrington High School, just 45 minutes away from here. And my question was, you all have said you worked in very different markets and locations for various sources and broadcast or print. And how does knowing your audience and in the field that you're working in, the location you're working in, influence your work and what you put out to the public?
That's a good question. And you know, one of the things that's happening, for instance, NBC shares space with Telemundo. And Telemundo's audience is almost entirely Hispanic and Spanish speaking. And so their emphasis is much more on immigration than, for instance, they will do more immigration stories than NBC itself, English-speaking NBC, will do. And one of the questions those journalists and I have all the time are, is there too much on immigration for them, too little for us, and that we all don't need to sort of diversify, because I think in a lot of markets you say, oh, this is a woman's story, you know, and NBC's got a Princess Diana special before. We better have a lot of women's stories that night to, you know, because that's the driver to the audience. It's a dilemma. It really is an ethical dilemma of, is it our job to is the news to tell you what you didn't know, not to feed whatever it is you think you do know? And I don't have a clean answer for that, but I know it's a struggle.
Could I take that one? I want to take a step back from the question and start by saying, yes, it's really great to know your market and to know your audience. But another really critical thing is this, especially now, get out of the echo chamber. It is so comfortable to be with people who have the same ideas, who look like you, who share the same views, and you are in this cloak of comfort, and it obfuscates everything. And you know what you know. You need to get out and find people in your social circles, in your life, who will bring you different points of view, who will help you learn about things that you don't know. And you should monitor your social media feed and look for people who you can learn from, who are different. Because you think you know the market, and yes, that's great, and yes, we do want to know the market. But there are so many wonderful, wonderful shades of things out there, and I would urge you to actively seek that. Get out of the echo chamber.
I'll give you an example. One of our students at DePaul, a stellar young reporter, just graduated. She went to work in Fayetteville, Arkansas. She wants to do, really great journalism. But the kind of journalism that they do, the kind of stories that they do in Fayetteville, Arkansas, aren't necessarily the kind of stories she was used to seeing done on channels 2, 5, 7, 32, whatever. And so it has been a really sharp turn for her. So as you go through your career, in the markets that you go to, and I'm sure this probably applies in print as well as broadcast, and I think the model has always been go small, work your way up. But those stories in those smaller markets, you have to realize the stories that you're doing there are just as important to people who live in a smaller town, smaller city, more agrarian, as opposed to the stories that are maybe City Hall centric, and you're dealing with Mayor Rahm Emanuel and Bruce Round or whatever. But the stories that you do in this one thing in the smaller markets are just as important to those people as the stories that you may do in Chicago. So you really have to learn to balance those things. And I think going out from high school to college, that first job, it's a tough kind of thing to move into. So you've got to be really prepared mentally, I think, to do that. I hope that answers that a little bit.
Hi, I'm Dalen, and I'm the program coordinator with one of Free Spirit Media's media journalism programs. And my question is, you guys all spoke about balance and whether or not a story needs to be balanced. And I know when I first got into journalism, that was something that they taught. But in the new era with like new media journalism, it kind of changes. So I was just wondering if one or all of you could maybe speak to what journalism used to be as far as rules and what was considered ethical journalism and where you think it is now and where it could possibly be headed to.
The ethics of yesterday should be the ethics of today.
I agree.
I mean, I don't.
They haven't changed.
I don't think there should be any wavering on ethics, and I don't think that's really what you're talking about. You may be talking about how you tell stories, but the things that we learned growing up, going to school, and our first jobs, and the ethical components that we practice today, and the ethical components we try to instill in our students, I think all remain the same. Telling stories is a little bit different. And I think we all learn to tell stories differently. And if I can just go back a little bit on this thing, I don't think necessarily that, for instance, if you're doing the thing that happened in Virginia with Confederate statues and all those stories. And I don't think you necessarily have to go and say, give me your opinion. A lot of those things are in the intent of the questions. You question everybody is hard. We tell people we're going to ask you the hardest question we can because the hardest questions get the best answers. So you're not there to throw softball questions in sort of some false equivalency thing, but going back to the ethics, I don't think the ethics ever change, and they shouldn't change. Ethics are a foundation of what we do, why we do it, and if we start trying to change those equations, then I think we're down a road that I don't know where it ends, but it ends very poorly.
The Society for Professional Journalists has a really well thought out code of ethics, and they include things like doctors, do no harm, do not seek to do harm, don't take favors, don't accept gifts. And if you have a conflict of interest, you've really got to reveal it or step away from the story. And a lot of experienced journalists, even in Chicago, sometimes do it. I've seen reporters interview their personal trainer for a story on health clubs. Well, you can't. It's your personal trainer. You're paying the guy, or you're getting, a discount from the guy. There are some really obvious ethical things that separate us from the world. I tell students, and I take the hardest line on this, the most conservative line, I guess. I don't give charitable contributions in my own name. When I became a reporter, I never signed another petition. I never was for abortion or against abortion publicly. We all have views and we all have feelings. But I'd lost, in my view, some of my privileges as a citizen for the privilege of being a reporter. That I've stepped away from some of those things that would tell someone that I wasn't going to be fair to them, or I wasn't going to be open with them. And I think that's part of it, is you've got to be willing to hear the things that you don't agree with in the fairness of trying to piece together the story that you're doing. So I believe that there is an ethical code that whatever we do, we follow.
And that doesn't mean you don't challenge people.
No, it doesn't mean you don't challenge people, but...
Challenge everybody.
Christy Parsons, who covered Barack Obama and was probably his favorite reporter, is also from the Tribune, one of the finest reporters that ever existed. And one of the things she said, she got the very last question of his administration in a press conference. One of the things she told our students after is, you know, I've covered him since he was a young state senator in Illinois, but we are not friends. You know, I am a respectful reporter. He is respectful of me. But we are not friends, because then you've really crossed the line.
You know, I want to mention something that's related to this. Be careful in what you say and how you behave, because I know this is you know, the Girl Scout stuff, you know, it's kind word and, you know, be thoughtful and kind, what is it? Word and deed, and thought, word and deed. But language is a behavior. And if you practice a behavior, you become that behavior. And so I think you have to be very careful not to be cynical, not to say those things about the other or whatever it is. You really have to discipline yourself to kind of watch yourself, because if you say those things, that becomes how you act. You know, be careful. Language is a behavior.
Okay, got one here. We've got a couple more.
Hi, so my name is Nia Maris, and I just graduated from DePaul in June. So this is more of a personal situation of what happened at work. I currently work at CBS Chicago. So as I'm a news apprentice there, so I get hopped around to different departments, and I was given a press release to write up for social media. And in doing that press release, there was obviously a little bit of bias. It's a brand that put out a press release. And I wrote up the press release, and I gave it to the social media editor, and she ended up inserting a quote. And the quote was inserted in a way that was kind of looking like we interviewed this woman on the street or something. And going back and forth with the social media editor who included the quote, she said she found the quote from a private Facebook page that she has a friend in, this and that. And I told her, we went back and forth, and I wanted the quote omitted, and she said no. So I told her, don't put my name on the story. She didn't. And in the end, it still got published online, but I just wanted to know
Good for you.
You did everything right.
Good for you.
So how would you guys
You've learned your lessons well. You're exactly right.
So, I mean, I'm coming out of school thinking we still have to do man-on-the-street interviews and earn quotes. So how would you guys have kind of handled that situation?
The way you did.
Yeah.
Take my name off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the next level up is I would want to, when the dust has settled, I think it's appropriate to go back and say, do you have some guidelines on how we handle these things? Because that clearly is a problem with the system, and somebody needs to take a look at that. But you have to do it disconnected from your conflagration. You got to just have a little distance.
Marsha Bartel was a producer for Dateline in Chicago, in the country, in NBC Network, and confronted a situation that that caused her to have to bail.
Yeah. Bravely
bail.
You guys.
And
She's
sometimes fighting with your editor or your boss means something's got to give, and you either be prepared to be fired or quit on principle. You know, Marsha, will you explain what you did?
Well, I was let go. The series was To Catch a Predator. I think if anyone's here, I'm Chris Hansen and I'm catching a predator. But there were a lot of ethical questions with that series, and I was a producer on a couple, and at that point I said, I'm not doing any more. This is not right. And so I was laid off in a massive layoff, and then I sued. And I was told I probably wouldn't win. And I said, that's okay as long as it exposes what's happening. So we put in a lawsuit, many of the unethical issues, and that was that. And so now I'm working at WGN.
You were punished. You were not laid off.
You were punished
for doing the right thing.
And you know, you've got your rent to pay, and you've got groceries to buy, and these ethical decisions sometimes are really hard. Mm-hmm. They're really hard. But you know, good for you.
Thank you. It was tough. I had 22 wonderful years with NBC and one really bad one. So,
good morning. I'm Odette Alcazarin-Keeley, and I wanted to just jump off very quickly on a point from Dalen's question from Free Spirit Media, because I think we're in an unprecedented time, and what you said about the SPJ principles very much reflective of Poynter Institute of Journalism principles: report the truth as fully as possible and minimize harm as a journalist, correct? But at a time when our fourth estate, our work is under attack, and when there is unprecedented lack of access to truth and information of this administration and this White House, and how do you actually report on things that are sometimes blatant falsehoods, and how do you parse that out as a journalist? I'm curious to see how emerging journalists approach that and try to access that information, nuance that information, present the truth in the reporting as fully as possible when there are sources who are out there covering the truth.
First of all, I don't think we're in unprecedented times. I'll go back to Watergate, and I think what we're seeing now is a lot of what was happening back then. So I take a little different approach that this is unprecedented.
But I think, you know what? I am so proud of this era of journalism. I mean, notwithstanding, there's always been junk. There have always been people who were slanted and twisted. That's always true. But when you look at the Washington Post reporting on Roy Moore, when you look at the fact that there's now fact-checking everything that comes out of the administration and calling it a falsehood or the truth. I mean, I think reporters are heavily challenged, but we've been challenged before. Going back to Richard Nixon, Don was booed as a brand new first-day reporter who'd never reported on him, but got booed because he was a reporter. Wear the badge proudly. Lester Holt said, stop being afraid of the criticism. If people don't like us, get used to it. They don't like us anyway. But like what you do. And if you love what you do, and the people up here love what they do, you're blessed.
I think an interesting thing that I've been having some conversations recently about getting a series of videos around the topic of journalism out into the world, and we've been working with some social media strategists, and the way that they think about their work is that, you know what, it doesn't actually, unfortunately in this day and age, matter if the content, what the quality of the content is, because of the kinds of peer-to-peer networks that are out there that are framing things in a way that they want the conversation to go. So they're giving us advice on strategically this particular series of videos, how can we harness the influencers out there and make sure that this content that we think is really strong, and we think, no one will be able to deny that. The content will be strong, the storytelling will be good. How do we then build it into our plan and our proposal as we're trying to raise money for this series of videos now to take the next step about when it gets out into the world, and how to help it go blast through those echo chambers and try to live on its own without the kind of framing of these influencers who, that is their entire job, is people out there who are not creating content but trying to spin it in a certain way. So I think it's an interesting question for journalism organizations to think about, how do we start to handle and try to influence the way that our content is moving through these peer-to-peer networks, which is the way that people communicate.
Okay, we have time for just a couple more questions.
Hi, I was a reporter for the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Sun-Times. My background, one of the things that happened to me when I started in journalism, I was beaten by the police. And when I came to the Tribune, I brought that perspective with me, that a lot of the people who cover the police wanted to be friendly with the police. But I saw them in a different light I saw them calling me all kinds of names and everything like that. I was just wondering if I could throw that question out to you guys. What do you think about that? I mean, all of us bring different perspectives to the newsroom. And I was at the Tribune from 73 to 79. And we bring different perspectives to the newsroom. And I also covered the police at 11th and State. So I just wanted to throw that out. What do you think about that? Also, your sources don't have to like you, but they do have to trust you.
Yes.
And the thing is that you can write something. If your source disagrees with it or thinks you really screwed it up, but they'll not talk to you. But if they trust you, they'll keep talking to you.
Well, the difference is, if your source doesn't like what you wrote, but what you wrote, to the best of your knowledge, was true, then you've lost a source. But you've told the truth. I covered John Burge, who tortured an awful lot of people for an awful lot of time when no one spoke out. I wasn't beaten by the police, and I'm sorry you were. The fact is that the police aren't my friends, but they're not my enemy either, because all police haven't beaten people. You know what I mean? And so we have this experience. I was slugged by a National Guardsman in an anti-war protest with a giant baton. So, I mean, I know the outrage of that, but our job is to sort of struggle with who we are and what our experiences are, and also realize that we have a wider lens and a responsibility to show the terrible things police have done, but also recognize that it's not a total generalization. And those are the tricky balances. We're human. We struggle. And obviously you have, I do, and that's part of our challenge, I think.
I want to speak to the Tribune part of this. When you talk about 40 years ago, I have no idea, but I can guess, because I was starting my career in that period. I think that there was, across many newsrooms, that whole relationship with police is very different now than it was 40 years ago. It was largely old school, and it was largely men and covering those things, and it was easier for them to be buddy-buddy. I don't think it's been that way certainly in our coverage, and at least, heavens, 25 years or so. It's been a long time since that kind of thing. I would be, never say never, but I would be surprised if anything like that exists now. If anything, we catch a lot of heat from the police union because we are so much more aggressive in telling those stories, like Laquan McDonald and many others. So, yeah, I mean, I don't doubt for a moment that there were those kinds of situations, not just here, but across the business, where there were a lot of people who were very palsy-walsy with the institutions, not just police. I think that is less the case now. I invite others to weigh in on that.
I think bringing these different perspectives to the newsroom, they're valuable, but also, you say you had a particular experience with the police, and so that kind of impacted the way that I don't know where you went, I like to look at people, impacted the way that you reported on certain stories. But in all newsrooms, we go through a process of, I write this story, this is my first draft, my editor looks at it, and then maybe a news director or whoever else is over your editor looks at it, and I think that in those processes, it strips down maybe like the bias that you could have had when you were covering those stories, and that's why it's so important for your stories to like go through those cycles, right? Because again, we're all people, so we all have personal experiences and we have opinions, but we also have an editor that's going to say, look, Resita, no, we're not putting that quote in there, and then we have a news director say, oh no, we can't do it that way, and then it goes back. And so I think that there are practices in place to kind of get us closer to what that truth is and kind of take some of our personal perspectives out.
Got one more.
My name is Alizea, and I go to North London. Sorry. and I go to North Lawndale College Prep on the west side, and I work at Hoops High. And also I did like a girlfriend's training over the summer, and we were kind of like talking about how the media doesn't really put the stories of black women or women out there as much as they would portray the male. And I just wanted to ask, how could you put the stories of the women out more, you know, being women? And I had another question I wanted to ask, what type of experiences did you face, and did you face sexism in the media being women?
I'm not answering that.
I think the way we get those stories out there is that we get more journalists, women journalists, female journalists, to pitch those stories, because like we said, a lot of newsrooms are dominated by a certain type of person, and in order to diversify our coverage, we have to diversify our newsrooms. And so in my opinion, that's how we keep, you go, if you want to be a journalist, you go to school and be a journalist, you become a journalist, and those stories you want to see, you pitch those stories, and you do those stories.
I'm sorry.
And as far as sexism, yes, yes, I had a very terrible experience. I don't even want to get into at my last newsroom that I experienced because I was a woman. And you will experience things because you are a woman. You will experience things because you are black. I have had sources tell me, I think we should go back to the way it was 200 years ago. And I'm just looking at him like, okay, and you have to do, it goes back to having a tough skin. You're breaking down, you're busting through these glass ceilings, and you're breaking down barriers, and you just have to know that you're doing it for the people who are to come after you. Unfortunately, we're not at a place where that doesn't exist, and I would be lying to you if I said that it didn't. So you'll go through those things, unfortunately, but you will learn how to handle them and use them as experiences to push you forward and to go even harder in the newsroom and tell even better stories so no one can challenge you.
Don and I did a documentary in North Lawndale on Manly Career Academy, which was, the principal at the time was an African-American woman, and there was a white New York Jewish woman running a program, and they were sort of ebony and ivory. And it was this incredible story of how they worked together to get more and more of the Manly kids who didn't even have a decent library, had a swimming pool that nobody ever swam in, didn't have a football field, didn't have anything, how they got an amazingly higher number of Manly students to get to college. And so I think when we talk about the media, there is no the media. There are local news, network news, a million publications, a million sites online. One of the things I think that, and we've done a poor job of this too, is explaining that the media no longer has a meaningful definition until you specify what is it? Is it network television? Is it the cables? Or is it magazines? Is it conservative or liberal magazines? And so as you think about this, remember it's a huge spectrum that you're thinking about joining. And if you're in the media, no one's going to know what that means until you try to tell them what it is.
We are very sensitive to this, and we make an effort as part of our coverage that we are aware that the volume of coverage about some of the news is bent towards some of the negative news, and we're well aware of that. And we try very consciously. One of our newsroom principles and values that are sort of our operating mission talks about those things about slice of life and the things about helping people see the Chicago that is much more than just breaking news. And I have two names for you of people you should Google, because they write the very kinds of stories that you were talking about. Lolly Bowman, her name is L-O-L-L-Y, and her last name is Bowman, B-O-W-E-A-N. She is a gem. She's been honored several times by local organizations because she writes those kinds of stories. She just got back from a Nieman Fellowship at Harvard, and she is so excited. She has one primary beat, but then we want her writing those stories. And she covers the Obama Library and and the development of all that and the issues in the neighborhoods. So she is spectacular. And the other person who is just wonderful, and she writes a column and tends to look for those ideas and would welcome them, is Darlene Glanton. Darlene, D-A-H-L-E-E-N, Google her, you'll find some of her stories. Glanton, G-L-A-N-T-O-N. Darlene is a very experienced, longtime reporter, has done a whole range of things, has been a national correspondent, was a finalist for Pulitzer Prize in commentary writing last year, her first year of writing a column. She is looking actively for these stories. We want to know about them. They're an important part of telling people about what Chicago is. They add dimension, and we actively seek those stories.
I just want to mention a program. Kartemquin Films partners with the Chicago Community Film Workshop to have a program called Diverse Voices in Documentary, which is a cohort of, it's a 9-month program every year, filmmakers of color coming together on a monthly basis to have workshops with different experts in the industry to develop their skills as documentary filmmakers. And the idea is that the work will be better the more voices are in the field telling their stories. It makes the work better. It's not just a question of diversity for diversity's sake. It helps us as a society talk to each other better and understand ourselves better, the greater variety of voices that are in the room. So if you're interested in documentaries, that's an interesting program.
And you're here, so leave your phone number if there's something that you guys want to get presented to the newsroom. I mean, the more people who call in, make connections, the more stories that we can get and that we can hear about. And so that's what I would advise you to do, is don't be silent. Don't just sit back, interact. Because all of us want to do better stories. And if there's stories we're missing, let us know. That's all I have to say.
Great. Thank you all so much once again. And I also just want to thank one more time our co-sponsors, WGN, Natus, and Free Spirit Media. And yeah, just if we could give a final round of applause to our panelists.
Thanks to everybody. A couple of things about resources. Carol mentioned the Society of Professional Journalists. They have a website, spj.org, and if you go to that website, you can print out the Journalist Code of Ethics that Carol was talking about. Also, in the back, the Tribune, Margaret Holt brought, I think, 100 copies of their Code of Editorial Principles. Definitely pick that up, along with the handouts that Carol and Don brought from DePaul University. And then, Maggie, can you hold up that?
Yes. This is the Center for Media and Social Impact at American University, which is a real leader in the fair use movement. And then, so there's a lot of great resources there. One of them is the Documentary Filmmaker Statement of Best Practices. And they also have them for all kinds of different makers. And so there's one that's for journalists as well. The principles are the same underlying all of them. There are also a lot of examples on the website to look at. But this is, I can't say enough. This document, it's super short. It'll take you like 15 minutes to read, and it'll change your life and save your archival budget.
Right. And then also diverse voices in docs. Yeah. I would strongly encourage, there's a couple of people I know here, students I know here, who would thrive in that environment. It's a wonderful program. I participated in the inaugural program a few years ago. Can you talk about, there's a deadline coming up on that, right?
Actually, it's today. The deadline to apply for to be part of the next cohort is today. So let me know if that's something you're interested in, and I can help you, figure out. If you haven't yet thought about it and you want to apply for this year, we could have a conversation. I could put you in touch with the program lead. But it's an incredible program, and we just had a couple of months ago, the graduation of this year's class, where everyone showed, down at the Logan Center at the U of C, showed clips from their films. It's so exciting, just really incredible work that really matures a lot over the course of the year of workshops.
Right. Yeah, so spj.org, the Tribune's handouts, the DePaul's handouts, also the Chicago Headline Club. If you visit their website, I think they have a hotline if you have any specific questions about ethics-related issues. You should visit their website as well. So a number of resources to tap into. Again, I'd like to thank the panel and Free Spirit Media, Anjali, and thank you for coming out today to join us.
Good luck in your career. Oh, yeah, I think so too.
Can I ask your help?
Yes. I'm going to take a picture of
Oh, yeah.
your thing so I can, excuse me.